It was from the nameless that heaven and earth sprang. The named is but the mother that rears the 10,000 creatures, each after its kind. Truly, only he that rids himself forever of desire can see the secret essences. He that has never rid himself of desire can see only the outcomes. Lao Tzu. Today's commentary, we are returning to Aldous Huxley's Perennial philosophy, and the chapter is on the nature of the ground. What is the ground? And no, I don't mean the literal ground of which I'm standing upon, which is wood, 2 by 4s. What is the ground that all of reality is standing upon? According to Aldous Huxley, quote, "The divine ground of all existence is a spiritual absolute, ineffable in terms of discursive thought, but in circumstances susceptible of being directly experienced and realized by the human being. This absolute is the God without, form of Hindu and Christian mystical phraseology. The last end of man, the ultimate reason for human existence, is unitive knowledge of the divine ground, the knowledge that can come only to those who are prepared to die to self, and so make room, as it were, for God. Out of any given generation of men and women, very few will achieve the final end of human existence, but the opportunity for coming to unitive knowledge will, in one way or another, continually be offered until all sentient beings realized who, in fact, they are. To see reality as it is requires us to transcend our thoughts. This is the purpose of meditation and other spiritual practices. When our thoughts subside, we access pure awareness. Everything is occurring in this awareness. Who and what we think we are is an illusion. In what is commonly referred to as a mystical experience, the ego sense of self is revealed to be an illusion, and the true self is revealed. As Alan Watts said, we are an aperture in which the universe is experience itself. The purpose of life is to discover this secret, which is hidden so brilliantly in plain sight. The realization of this truth is called enlightenment, which we will address in the future. Quote, "The sincere worship of such a God changes character as well as conduct, and does something to modify consciousness. But the complete transformation of consciousness, which is enlightenment, deliverance, salvation, comes only when God is thought of as the perennial philosophy affirms him to be. Immanent as well as transcendent, suprapersonal as well as personal. And when religious practices are adapted to this conception. Typically in Abrahamic religions in particular, God is thought of as a bearded man in the sky. We've built entire societies with this worldview, that we must behave morally because the man in the sky is watching us and will send us to heaven or hell accordingly. Man, God must see some seriously fucked up shit to keep the universe running. Not only on this planet, but all of them. Infinite levels of fucked up. And I thought a Tekashi 6ix9ine video was awful. We can view God in this way, but a more subtle way, as is common in Hinduism and Buddhism, but also esoteric forms of other traditions too, is to see God as the principal life force within the universe, Atman, and permeates all things. When aligned with this state, one experiences enlightenment or liberation. A funny thing about this is the truth was under your nose the whole time, figuratively speaking, of course. If anyone sells you the instant enlightenment under your nose method, they're probably full of shit. Except for ketamine nasal spray, of course. Huxley quotes Eckhart on the nature of the Godhead. When I came out of the Godhead into multiplicity, then all things proclaimed, there is a God, the personal creator. Now this cannot make me blessed, for hereby I realize myself as a creature. But in the breaking through, I am more than all creatures. I am neither God nor creature, nor duck. I am that which I was and shall remain, now and forever, now and forevermore. There I receive a thrust which carries me above all angels. By this thrust I become so rich that God is not sufficient for me, in so far as he is only God in his divine works. For in thus breaking through, I perceive what God and I are in common. There I am what I was. There I neither increase nor decrease. For there I am the immovable which moves all things. Here man has won again what he is eternally and ever shall be. Here God is received into the soul. Eckhart was a Christian mystic, but for those of you who are familiar with Eastern philosophy, it sounds quite Buddhist. It certainly has that cryptic, riddle-like language that makes my head hurt. How is it possible that something, and we assume this thing to be the ground of existence, to be immovable, but moves all things? This is certainly a paradox in terms of meditation. If you've done a few times, or make a habit of it, which I highly recommend for any kind of spiritual work or inquiries of the self, you'll notice that the mind is constantly changing, to a really obnoxious degree, if you notice. So the thoughts are moving, and occasionally you'll notice you're thinking, and yet there is still something observing the thoughts. That's just one example of how this is possible. The consciousness which observes reality is constant, which its content is constantly changing. Everything around us is an aspect of the broader divine consciousness. Each of us are an incarnation of God, but in a more limited form. The ground in which the multifarious and time-bound psyche is rooted is a simple, timeless awareness. By making ourselves pure in heart and pure in spirit, we can discover and be identified with the awareness. In the spirit, we not only have, but are, unitive knowledge of the divine ground. It is through God that they have their becoming, a becoming whose goal and purpose is to return to the eternity, to the ground. The mystical view of reality is counterintuitive to us, particularly in modern Western society, because we have a linear view of time. There's a beginning and an end to this video, a beginning and end to our day, and a beginning and end to our lives. But if we look at things for how they actually are, these are just measurements. They're real to us because that's how we are trained to view reality. The Perennial philosophy points out how mystics in all religious traditions emphasize infinite love, infinite bliss, and an eternal now. We are not separate from God or each other, but aspects and reflections of God and each other. And the annoying duck that won't shut the fuck up in the background. Quote, in other words, there is a hierarchy of the real. The manifold world of our everyday experience is real with a relative reality that is, on its own level, unquestionable, but this relative reality has its being within, and because of the absolute reality, which, on account of the incommensurable otherness of its eternal nature, we can never hope to describe, even though it is possible for us to directly apprehend it. Well, from what I've heard from a lot of people who've experienced the absolute on DMT, 5-MeO DMT, LSD, psilocybin, ketamine, psilocin, and 4-HO-DBT, ibogaine, ecstasy, and mescaline, to name a few. So now we're in a territory that's going to get me in some trouble. And I don't mean the drug references. You can experience aliens and gods and psychedelics, and people won't think you're insane for the most part. It's kind of trendy now, in fact. The part which can get you into a bit of trouble is when you take these phenomena seriously without the drugs. What does Huxley mean by relative and absolute reality? The relative reality is the one we experience: traffic, bank accounts, taxes, and snorting coke out of a hooker's ass, if you are adventurous. Absolute reality is the realm of the gods, so to speak, seeing reality in a total perspective, transcending our limited selves to experience the higher self. Quote, the world as it appears to common sense consists of an indefinite number of successive and presumably causally connected events, involving an indefinite number of separate individual things, lives, and thoughts, the whole constituting a presumably orderly cosmos. It is in order to describe, discuss, and manage this common sense universe that human languages have been developed. Our perception of reality is significantly shaped by our language. We have to ask ourselves if the way we see the world is, in fact, the way it is, or do we see the world shaped through our perception? Now, this is a big-ass quote, so I'm going to break it up into a few sections. Whenever, for any reason, we wish to think of the world, not as it appears to common sense, but as a continuum, we find that our traditional syntax and vocabulary are quite inadequate. Mathematicians have therefore been compelled to invent radically new symbol systems for this express purpose. But the divine ground of all of existence is not merely a continuum. It is also out of time and different, not merely to a degree, but in form, but in kind from the worlds to which traditional language and the languages of mathematics are adequate. Hence, in all expositions of the perennial philosophy, the frequency of paradox, of verbal extravagance, sometimes even of seeming blasphemy. Nobody has yet invented a spiritual calculus, in terms of which we may talk coherently about the divine ground and of the world conceived of as its manifestation. I'm pleased to tell you that today there exists someone who has created a spiritual calculus and who also claims to be smarter than Einstein. Huxley is saying that to make sense of our existence using the current ways of looking at the world through language and mathematics is a bitch. The fact is, one must be steadily borne in mind by all who read its formulations. Only in this way shall we be able to understand, even remotely, what is being talked about. Consider, for example, those negative definitions of the transcendent and immanent, ground of being. In statements such as Eckhart's, God is equated with nothing. And in a certain sense, the equation is exact, for God is certainly no thing, in the phrase used by Scotus. God is not a what, he is a that. In other words, the ground can be denoted as being, but not defined as having qualities. This means that discursive knowledge about the ground is not merely, like all inferential knowledge, a thing at one remove, or even several removes, from the immediate acquaintance. It is, and because of the very nature of our language and our standard patterns of thought, it must be paradoxical knowledge. Direct knowledge of the ground cannot be had except by union. Union can be achieved only by the annihilation of the self-regarding ego, which is the barrier separating the thou from thee. What does it mean for God to be no thing? Is God a being that we can't see, or a math equation, or a tiny particle we need to invest billions of dollars to find? Or what your partner never says during sex? Don't be so hard on yourself, pun intended. This is so paradoxical because you're looking for the very thing that is seeing. Finding God is not a matter of more conceptual knowledge, or just a psychedelic experience, or even that weird so-called tantric workshop you took pre-COVID where things got a little bit freaky. It is a direct experience of seeing the divine in all things, including yourself. That concludes today's episode. I am Parker Tebow of Focus Shift Media. Follow me on Instagram at Focus Shift Media. Feel free to check out our website at focusshiftmedia.net, where our editing and motion graphics and services are available. Feel free to email us or comment down below any books or topics that you would like to be covered in the future. And a special shout out to my friend Alec, who is behind the cameras and helping me set up these commentaries for all of you to see. Have a good one.